Yeah, there's a lot of value in Aristotle. There's a lot of value in Cicero. Yeah, there's a lot of value in Marcus Aurelius. And they give us those four virtues, but those four virtues are incomplete without faith, hope, and love. And it's faith, hope, and love that is the ruler over those virtues.
Welcome to the Post-Christian Podcast, where we help you make disciples in our increasingly post-Christian world. My name is Eric Bryant. I'm the campus pastor at Gateway in South Austin and Gateway Austin Online. I'm also the founder of Catalyzing Community. Sign up for our email newsletter at ericbryant.org and we'll send you free resources. Well, on this episode of the Post-Christian Podcast, I have with me Joey Dodson. How you doing, Joey?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me.
It's great to have you. I was very fascinated as I've come across some of your interviews because I've got some folks here in my church who really ascribe to Stoicism. And I've also got even an extended family member who worships Apollo. Like there seems to be this
Okay, right.
emergence of interest
Yeah.
in Greek philosophy, and you are an expert in both the scriptures and the intertestamental writings, the people who are influencing those who are really writing the New Testament. Talk for a little bit, if you don't mind. You give this great analogy of how Socrates and Plato relate to Jesus and John and Paul. Maybe for just a quick primer in what is Greek philosophy and why is it so important, and how can we kind of understand it as followers of Jesus?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for that. It's probably started when I was in high school. I had a history professor make a comment that Homer was like the Old Testament for the Greeks, and Plato was like the New Testament for the
Hmm.
Greeks. And I found that fascinating. I was a closet nerd, and so I went and got a copy of the Republic out of the office, out of the library, and I would like hide it from my friends because I didn't want to out myself as a nerd. But I began to read, and which is absolutely fascinated. And I don't know if my history professor just came up with that as a seminal thought or if he got it from someone else, but it continues to really seem to track. So if Homer and the Odyssey and the Iliad were kind of the Old Testament, then you have Plato coming on. And just like, Plato, Socrates didn't write anything. Plato was kind of his beloved disciple, if you will, is the closest I can get to that. And so we have Xenophon and Plato give us the teachings of Socrates. And Socrates comes and to introduce new gods, to corrupt young minds, to say that the gods of the poets, the gods that we see in Homer and Iliad, that's not the true God. And our God has to be a God of virtue. And so, yeah, Socrates is kind of like the Jesus of the day. And then you have Plato, that's like his beloved disciple. And then Aristotle is a student of Plato. And so these are the ones who are kind of like the parallel of early Christianity. And from that, we have these denominations that break out, just like we have in Christianity. And so, yeah, that's a kind of a quick recap of that. Paul grew up in Tarsus, as your audience probably knows, and Tarsus was an Ivy League town. It was a place where a lot of the philosophers lived. When the Romans sacked Athens back around 150 BC, there was a dispersion, just like we have the dispersion of the Jewish people. The philosophers dispersed, and some go to Alexandria because of the really awesome library. Some go to Rome, obviously. Some go to Corinth. So there's a lot of influence with philosophy in Corinth, and some go to Tarsus. In fact, Paul even quotes a Tarsian philosopher, so a Stoic philosopher from Tarsus. But yeah, so that's kind of a quick response. If you want more, I'm happy to
Yeah.
dig in more.
Paul writes in order to, in many ways, help give a new version of reality, a new worldview.
Mm-hmm.
And people
Mm-hmm.
had, more and more a Platonic worldview. What are some of the ways that Paul addresses that and really kind of right sizes our way of thinking in the New Testament?
Sure. Yeah. Very good. So we have kind of middle Platonism. So we have different versions of Platonism. So like classical early Platonism, and then middle Platonism is kind of what characterizes the time that's surrounding Paul, and it begins to infiltrate Judaism as well. And so on the one hand, Paul is probably getting it from the high schools and the quote unquote universities of Tarsus, but on the other hand, even the Judaism which he has adopted has been influenced by Platonic thought. But where Paul and even John especially are going to pushback at the Platonism is the idea that the body is bad, the body is gross. And so we see this especially in 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul seems to be building up, building up, building up to the crescendo of 1 Corinthians 15 to say, no, 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 it has to be a bodily resurrection against those who think that, yeah, there's life everlasting, but that life is that of the soul. Paul comes and says, no, 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 it's got to be the BOD. Why the bodies. And so this is going to be the biggest significance that Paul is going to say, okay, there's some things possibly about the Platonic thought that we can get behind, such as like virtues, like courage, self-control, wisdom, righteousness. But this idea of the body being bad, which ended up leading to kind of some Christian Gnosticism later on, and or to some either asceticism or overindulgence, Paul is going to push back on that idea.
Well, and I've even heard N.T. Wright describe that sometimes our view of heaven and hell is more based in Plato than in the New
Yeah,
Testament. You know, I
right.
think there's a lot of us as church leaders who have kind of in this increasingly post Christian world, people who take bits and pieces from different worldviews and kind of mash it into their own. What are
Mm.
some ways that you think the church or church leaders should help those who follow Jesus let go of Plato and Socrates? And, you know, if you were writing your own version of Paul's writings, you know, what were some of the things you would address to help us move towards an actual biblical worldview?
Yeah, well, I would probably take a page out of Augustine's work, where Augustine's going to see, yeah, there's a lot of value in Aristotle. There's a lot of value in Cicero. Yeah, there's a lot of value in Marcus Aurelius. And they give us those four virtues, but those four virtues are incomplete without faith, hope, and love. And it's faith, hope, and love that is the ruler over those virtues. And so, yeah, and I love what I think it's Augustine who says it. You know, it's like I've read some transformative things in Plato. I've read some life changing quotes in Epictetus. But you know, I've never heard either of them say, "Come to me, all you who are weary, and I will give you rest." And so,
Hmm.
yeah, there's some great value, especially in our pursuit to imitate God and to cast off our fleshly desires. But the Paul's triad eclipses the four virtues or supports those with adding faith, hope, and love to it.
Well, and some of what you've written or edited can be found certainly under Joseph R. Dodson. I want to talk for a minute about certainly we've hit on Paul and the Giants of Philosophy, which will be giving
Mm-hmm.
away a free copy to
Oh,
some of you who
thanks.
sign up to
Mm-hmm.
ericbryant.org, our email newsletter. But there's also Conquerors, Not Captives, when you're reframing Romans 7. And the reason that I think this is important is those who kind of take on maybe a Stoic view of thinking. You write this great article. I think it's going to be part of a book that you're coming out with that shows how Seneca and Paul talk about taking up the cross, but
Mm-hmm.
there's a giant difference. Like to be able to live out a Stoic way of thinking is impossible in our own. This battle between the flesh and the spirit. And so a lot of us have looked to Romans 7 and said, well, if Paul can't even pull it off, then why should I? You know, I can't even
Yeah.
do this. The Romans 7, of course, referencing the what I want to do, I don't do, and what I don't want to do, I do. But you actually have, I think, a more biblical understanding of this that could really, I think, right size even this debate. What Jesus has to offer is transformation, not hopelessness. Talk
Yeah.
a little bit about that Romans 7 understanding versus what you think we really should see it as.
Sure. Well, let me start with the metaphor of the cross that Seneca and Paul do. I should probably maybe introduce Seneca really quickly.
Sure.
So, with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, we have these different denominations, if you will, of philosophies. One is the Epicureans, which you're probably familiar with. The ultimate pursuit of life is that of pleasure. And the Stoics kind of push back against that. And I think this is one reason we have Stoicism becoming more popular in our American culture, is that the pendulum has kind of swung to the treat yourself to now people are kind of reacting. It's like, wait a second, seeking after these pleasures, they don't actually bring fulfillment. And so I think this is one reason that Stoicism is being so much more attracted. One thing that Tom Wright brings out that is important to understand is that even though our society is more Epicurean, kind of following more drinking from that, in the Roman culture, it was much more Stoic. And so
Hmm.
Stoics are going to put themselves over against the Epicureans, so the Yankees versus the Red Sox, if you will. So the Stoics are going to do that, and you have guys like Zeno and Chrysippus, but the most, and some of your people are probably familiar with Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius is kind of like the Taylor Swift of Stoicism, but the classical music, the most prolific Stoic that we have is this guy named Seneca. Seneca is brothers with Gallio, the guy at Corinth that is a governor that adjudicates on Paul's behalf. When
Interesting.
Paul stands before Nero the first time, it's probably Seneca's in the mix if he's not just talking to Seneca rather than Nero
Wow.
at that point. And so he's writing contemporaneously with Paul. He is about the same age as Jesus, and anyway, so yeah, he's the guy that I spend most of my time with as far as a dialogue partner. And in his writings, as this Roman senator, philosopher, he talks about himself being crucified. Which,
Hmm.
if you know anything about the first century, proper people did not say that word. The crux was a four-letter word. You just don't say this in polite company. And if you remember, crucifixion was that for non-Romans. Romans weren't even crucified, but here, this Roman senator talks about how he has been crucified, and the cross represents for him sinful passions, sinful
Hmm.
desires. And not only has he been crucified, but he's been crucified with these giants of philosophy, the likes of Plato. And he uses this metaphor because there are people that are giving him a hard time for being a hypocrite, for not practicing what he preaches. And so the short of it is that he's saying, I'm on my cross of sin and I'm trying to get off. So when I preach, I'm preaching to myself. And so he kind of plays this humble card and says that I've been crucified with all those. And the difference between us and the haters going to hate is that we're trying to get off the cross while they are not just basking on on one cross, but as many beams as possible. And so I found it fascinating that you have that in comparison to Paul in Galatians, his first letter, where he talks about being crucified with Christ. It's so familiar to us, it doesn't shock us. We're like, oh yeah, I go across. But in the first century, for apostle, a Jewish apostle, and a Roman senator to say that they've been crucified, for Paul, he hasn't been crucified with Plato and the likes of giants of philosophy, but with Christ over to the world. And it gives him that swagger. So for
Hmm.
Seneca, he can't get off the cross. He's trying to as much as he wants to, but it sounds a lot like what we see in Romans 7 as a segue. The things I want to do, I don't do. The things I don't want to do, that's what I find myself doing. In fact, this word wretch that Paul uses in Romans 7 was a standard Stoic term for someone who wanted to do good but didn't have the power to
Hmm.
do it. But Paul has this swagger, like I no longer live, not I, but Christ that lives within me, and the world has been crucified as well. And so because of that, if we walk according to the power of the Spirit, we will not ever fulfill the desires of the sinful nature. And so it shows that even at the point of similarity, where they're consonant, there's this huge difference, and the difference comes in that Paul has this apocalyptic idea of, I think, not just metaphorically but literally being crucified with Christ so that he is a new creation. So I think if Paul and Seneca were to have a beer in Austin together, or some barbecue, I think Paul would encourage Seneca, like, hey, yeah, you're on the cross, but you're on the wrong cross. You need to get off your
Yeah.
cross and get on the cross of Christ, because the cross of Christ is where sin goes to die.
Yeah. Well, and you're saying something so important. I don't want us to miss this, but it's almost like what Paul is describing is we have the capacity to overcome, to live new lives, to be transformed. We don't have to be like those who do what they don't want to do and don't do what they
Mm-hmm.
want to do.
Yeah.
And that's one of the greatest witnesses to the
Mm-hmm.
world around us that
Yeah.
we can overcome. What are some of the ways you've seen uh, people who follow Jesus, pastors, church leaders, seminary students? You're at Denver
Mm-hmm.
Seminary, uh, live out this transformation. And how does that happen? I mean, just reading this passage doesn't change us. It's applying it, right? How do you live
Sure.
this out, this new life?
Yeah. Do you want me to talk a little bit more about Romans 7?
Yeah, yeah.
Because I gave the background to Galatians.
Yes, yes,
So
yes.
almost it's a very popular idea that Paul is talking about himself as a Christian in Romans 7. The things I want to do, I don't do. The things I don't want to do, that's what I find myself doing. Who will rescue me from this body of sin? Although that's popular among the pulpits and the people and most of the church people, this was not the original interpretation of Romans 7, and it's not the interpretation of the vast majority of scholars.
Mm.
Most New Testament scholars look at this idea of this being post-conversion Paul, post-Damascus Paul, is somewhat silly, to use maybe even a lighter word than what most scholars would say. We've read our own tradition and experience back into the text, and this is something that you don't do with Bible interpretation. You look at the context. And so Romans 7 I grew up in the 80s, and I use this illustration in the book as well, but of Cookie Monster, yeah, it's Cookie Monster, right? Yeah, where he comes out and has the sheet of cookies, like one of these things are not like the other. One of these just don't belong. And so that cookie in Romans 7 looks different than what anyone else in the New Testament, including Paul, including what Paul says in Romans 6 and Romans 8,
Yeah, right.
says about our relationship with sin. And so most scholars think that, and this is the original interpretation, that Paul is putting on a mask here.
Right.
Paul uses some philosophical tools in Romans that he doesn't use anywhere else. Just like in Romans 2, where he breaks the third wall, if you will, and says, "What about you, old man? You think you're all that? Don't you know it's the goodness of God?" And so Paul has this imaginary conversation going on from the beginning. Even Romans 1 is setting up, it's a trap to this diatribe. And so when Paul asks questions, well, shall I continue in sin so that grace may abound? This is probably putting words in the face of this person. And so most scholars think that here Paul is putting on a mask to show the futility of someone trying to live under the law rather than by the Spirit. And then
Mm.
other scholars, although not as large of a group, think that this is Paul talking about his pre-conversion experience before God knocked him off his donkey on the road to Damascus. And so,
Mm.
yeah, so what we see in Romans 7 should not be the center of how we understand our relationship with sin. Because it's so controversial, you don't have to get it off of the table, but you probably should look at what Paul says elsewhere, like in Galatians chapter 5. It's for freedom that Christ
That's
has set
right.
us free. So don't use your freedom. Or what Paul's going to say in Romans 6, say you died to sin. How can you live in it any longer? Or what he's going to say in
Right.
Romans 8. Don't you know that you're no longer obligated to fulfill the desires of sinful nature? And so Romans 7 is the oddball. It's very controversial. And what this is trying to argue is that whichever interpretation you take, the post-conversion version that Paul's talking about himself as a believer who wants to do good, it contradicts not only what he says in his other letters, but what he says in Romans 6 and Romans 8.
Yeah. Well, and he does say, I'm straining towards what is ahead. I haven't
Mm,
fully arrived, so
that's
we
right.
know there's still
Exactly.
a battle, but
Yeah,
but we've won. And we have to
that's right.
live like that, right? He
Hmm.
calls the
Yeah.
Corinthians saints, and they weren't acting like saints.
No, it's a church going wild. Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. So I do think that we as Christians struggle with sin and we're not going to reach a point of perfection. And Paul's going to say that to the Corinthians as well, right? When you think you stand firm, watch out because that's when you're going to fall. But guess what? No temptation has seized you except what is common. And God is faithful. He's going to provide a way out every time. And so we have to take that way out. And so, yeah, we are not becoming holy. We're not becoming sanctified. We are already sanctified and we're working out of that. And so
Yeah.
holiness should be the rule of our life. And when we fail, that should be the exception. But because our misinterpretation of Romans 7, we've switched that and think that we're going to fail. And then maybe every once in a while, we'll have a moment of holiness. And that's not the expectation. I think that is a way of quenching the Holy Spirit and
Mm.
giving our old Adam nature more power than the new creation of us being in Christ.
Yeah, that's so well said. Well, you're preparing future pastors and church leaders there at Denver Seminary. You've been a youth pastor for many years. You've
Yeah.
got 5 kids, so you're probably a youth pastor at home. What talk a little bit
Mm,
about what you're hoping to see seminary students or
mm.
the young people today. What do you hope to see the church become that maybe it isn't now? What are you trying to raise up there with the students you're working with?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for that question. And I'll try to connect that back to the previous question that you said as well. It's hard to not argue for unity since this is Jesus' last prayer. God,
Yeah.
please let them be one as we are one. So, John chapter 17, Jesus' last prayer is that we would be unified. And so, my hope and my prayer is that the church will be united. I spent time studying in Germany, and I had a unbeliever that would come to my house. He just couldn't understand how someone who was academic could believe in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And there are times, his name was Paul, he would get so upset that he would just start cursing me and just like leave. And I wouldn't see him for a few days, and he would come back. And I'd get to the point where it was like, he was so close. And at one point, he was like, you believe that there's this Jewish carpenter from boondocks, out in the middle of nowhere, who is the Son of God, who's Messiah, who came, who walked on water, who raised the dead, and he himself was raised and appeared and ascended to heaven, is right now sitting at the right hand of God. But why are there different denominations in your? And I was like, well, some people think that women should be pastors, others don't think. Some people think you need to baptize them in the Spirit. And he's like, wait a second. I don't understand how you can believe all those other things and then be divided on these other issues. And so obviously I want the church to be one. We talked about John 17, but also 1 Corinthians. But the way that the church has unity is that it has to have humility. And so we have to get to the point that we walk in Paul's humility, that they're not looking out for our own interests, but they're looking for the interests of others. And that humility only comes with the mind of Christ. And so this is something that you're going to have different between the philosophers and Paul, is that we're not just trying to renew our own minds, but we have the mind of Christ, the phronema, the nous of Christ, that makes all the difference in the world. And so at the seminary, my desire is to, let's go back to Plato. Plato in his Republic, which kind of be like the Romans of his New Testament, if you will, even talks about righteousness and justice there. But he says that we'll never have the utopia, the great place to live, until we have kings that are philosophers and philosophers that are kings. And to jack that from Socrates / Plato, I would say that we're never going to have the church that we need to be until we have pastors that are scholars and scholars that are pastors. And so in many of our traditions, it's kind of been more anti-intellectual. And so it's all about the heart. It's all about love. And, we'll emphasize passages where Paul will say, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. But Paul also says it's not good to be ignorant. He also says, I'm praying that God would add to your love all knowledge and all insight. And so we need pastors who just don't know what the right thing to think, but also how to think, how to reason. And so here we want to make sure that in my classes, I'm trying to make sure that we have students who are work people, who are not ashamed, who adequately handle the word of God, but also to love God. And so there's places that you can go that they're really good at the head stuff. And, they can tease out and elucidate the synoptic problem, prove or disprove Q or whatever it may be. You have other places that are really good about the heart, that make you just love Jesus and love the church. And what I'm trying to do in my class is to have both of those. And I think studying the philosophers alongside of Paul and Judaism before Jesus is a way to do that.
Well, you can find more about Joey at denverseminary.edu. Joey, thank you so much for taking some time to be with us. Keep up your great work.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us on the Post Christian Podcast. More resources available at ericbryant.org.